The year was 1987. In the bustling, sun-drenched city of Mobile, Alabama, Sunday was always a day of peace, reflection, and community. Families gathered, children played after church services, and the air hummed with a special kind of southern tranquility. But on one particular Sunday, that cherished peace was irrevocably shattered. A horrifying crime unfolded within the sacred walls of a local church, leaving a beloved pastor dead and an entire community reeling. For decades, the mystery of who could commit such an unspeakable act remained unsolved, a chilling whisper in Mobile's history, until an unexpected twist finally brought the truth to light. The story of Pastor David Reynolds' murder is one of devotion, despair, and the enduring quest for justice. Pastor David Reynolds was more than just a spiritual leader, he was the very heart of his congregation. His kind eyes and booming, yet gentle, voice were a constant source of comfort and inspiration to everyone who knew him. He had dedicated his life to serving others, guiding his flock through life's trials and celebrating their joys. His church, a beacon of hope nestled in the Mobile landscape, was the center of his universe, a place where he poured his boundless energy into sermons that uplifted souls and community programs that strengthened bonds. At home, he was a loving husband to Sarah, his steadfast partner, and a devoted father to their young son, Michael, who adored his dad's playful spirit and warm embrace. Pastor Reynolds' reputation was impeccable, a man of unwavering faith and integrity respected by all, his life a testament to unwavering commitment and selfless service. That fateful Sunday evening, after the last hymn had faded and the final congregant had departed, Pastor Reynolds remained in his sanctuary, perhaps reflecting on the day's service or preparing for the week ahead. The details of what transpired next are shrouded in darkness, but what is known is that shortly after, a terrified church elder, returning to retrieve forgotten items, discovered the unimaginable. Pastor David Reynolds lay lifeless inside the very church he cherished, the holy space desecrated by an act of brutal violence. Panic erupted, a stark, guttural cry tearing through the quiet night. Sirens soon wailed through the streets of Mobile, converging on the church as police cars, their lights flashing a somber warning, quickly sealed off the scene. The sight of crime scene tape adorning the entrance of their beloved church sent a collective gasp of horror through the community. The initial hours and days following the discovery were a whirlwind of activity, yet yielded little in the way of concrete answers. Detectives worked tirelessly, sifting through every piece of evidence, interviewing weeping congregants and shocked neighbors. They pieced together timelines, searched for witnesses, but the clues were scarce, the motive elusive. The community of Mobile was plunged into a collective state of shock and profound grief. How could such a thing happen to such a good man, in such a sacred place? The senselessness of the crime gnawed at everyone, leaving an open wound of fear and uncertainty. Hope for a swift resolution quickly faded as the initial leads went cold, leaving investigators and the grieving community frustrated and baffled by the silence surrounding Pastor Reynolds' untimely demise. This was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. If you're captivated by stories of justice finally served and mysteries that span decades, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community. We bring you compelling true crime stories from around the world, unraveling the threads of forgotten cases and celebrating the relentless pursuit of truth. The initial forensic findings only deepen the enigma surrounding Pastor Reynolds' brutal murder. There was no forced entry into the church, suggesting either the killer had a key, or more disturbingly, was let in by the pastor himself. The crime scene, while tragic, offered perplexing details. Nothing of significant value appeared to have been stolen. The collection plate was untouched, the church's small safe remained locked and undisturbed. This absence of a clear motive, beyond the heinous act itself, baffled detectives. If it wasn't robbery, what could it be? The violent nature of the attack seemed personal, yet Pastor Reynolds was universally loved, a man without enemies. This lack of a rational explanation fueled the fear that permeated Mobile. The brutal efficiency of the crime, coupled with its baffling lack of motive, left investigators grasping at shadows. The impact on the closely knit community of Mobile was immediate and devastating. The murder of Pastor Reynolds wasn't just a loss for his family, It was a wound inflicted upon the very soul of the city. A place of worship, once a sanctuary of peace, had been defiled. Trust, a cornerstone of any community, was eroded. Parents worried about the safety of their children. Neighbors eyed each other with a new, unsettling suspicion. The vibrant spirit of Mobile seemed to dim, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Church attendance dropped initially, not out of a lack of faith, but from a tangible fear that evil could strike anywhere, even in the most sacred of spaces. The laughter of children playing in churchyards grew quieter, replaced by the hushed whispers of adults grappling with an incomprehensible tragedy. For Sarah Reynolds, the pastor's widow, and young Michael, the world had come crashing down. Sarah was left to navigate an unimaginable grief, not only for the loss of her beloved husband but also for the shattering of their future. Every day was a struggle, a battle against overwhelming sorrow while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy for her son. Michael, barely school-aged, understood that his father was gone, but the permanence and brutality of it were beyond his young comprehension. He would often ask when Daddy was coming home, his innocent questions piercing Sarah's already broken heart. She had to be strong for him, even as her own strength wavered, a single mother now tasked with raising a child who would grow up without his father's gentle guidance, without his laughter echoing through their home. The absence was a gaping void, an ever-present reminder of the senseless act that stole their happiness. In the initial weeks and months, the police department pursued every possible lead, no matter how tenuous. There were whispered rumors about disgruntled former congregants, stories of old disputes, even the occasional eccentric outsider who had been seen near the church. Each rumor, each tip, was meticulously investigated. A few individuals became persons of interest, a drifter passing through town, a parishioner with a history of erratic behavior, a distant relative with a potential grudge. Detectives interviewed dozens, then hundreds of people. Each potential suspect was scrutinized, their alibis checked, their connections to Pastor Reynolds probed. But one by one, these leads fizzled out. The drifter had left town days before the murder, the parishioner had a solid alibi, and the relative's alibi was also ironclad. The evidence against any of them simply wasn't there. Despite the extensive efforts, the relentless hours and the desperate hope of the community, the case slowly but surely went cold. The trail vanished, leaving a heartbroken family and a bewildered police force with no answers, only a persistent, chilling silence that echoed through the years. The silence stretched, not just for weeks or months, but for years, long agonizing decades that transformed the vibrant city of Mobile. The headlines faded, the frantic police activity subsided, and while the name Pastor David Reynolds was still occasionally whispered in hushed tones, the fervor of the initial hunt for his killer inevitably waned. For the community, life, with its relentless demands and new tragedies, slowly moved forward, pushing the unsolved murder to the back pages of memory. But for Sarah Reynolds, time offered no such reprieve. Every sunrise was a stark reminder of the void, every sunset a day further from justice. She watched her son, Michael, grow from a bewildered little boy into a quiet, introspective man, always with the shadow of his father's unresolved death looming over him. He learned to live without a father's hand to guide him, without a father's voice to cheer him on, a constant, aching absence carved into their lives. The dedicated detectives who had poured their hearts into the original investigation aged, many retiring, their careers marked by the phantom of the Reynolds case, a puzzle with a missing, crucial piece. Yet the file, heavy with reports and witness statements, remained, gathering dust in the cold case archives, a testament to a promise unfulfilled. As the calendar pages turned, so too did the landscape of forensic science. What was once considered cutting-edge technology in 1987 became rudimentary by the turn of the millennium. The 1990s and early 2000s ushered in a revolution, particularly in the field of DNA analysis. Suddenly, microscopic biological traces, once dismissed as insignificant, held the power to unlock mysteries that had long defied traditional investigative methods. A strand of hair, a drop of sweat, a faint skin cell, these tiny pieces of evidence could now yield a unique genetic fingerprint, capable of identifying an individual with staggering accuracy. This advancement became the beacon of hope for countless cold cases across the nation, offering a second chance at justice for victims and their families when all other avenues had been exhausted. It was a scientific marvel that promised to redefine criminal investigations, turning the impossible into the possible. Fueled by this scientific evolution and an unwavering sense of duty, a new generation of mobile police detectives decided it was time to revisit the pastor's murder. The Cold Case Unit, a small but fiercely determined group, pulled the heavy, aged file from storage. The paper was yellowed, the photographs faded, but the tragic story within remained as poignant as ever. For these detectives, it wasn't just another forgotten case number. It was a human story, a family's enduring sorrow, and a stain on their city's history. They felt the emotional weight of those decades, the burden of the unanswered questions. There was a quiet, collective resolve to chip away at the silence, to apply every modern tool at their disposal to a crime committed in an era before such tools even existed. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about honoring a promise, albeit a long-delayed one, to Pastor Reynolds and his family. Their strategy was clear: re-examine everything. Every piece of physical evidence that had been meticulously collected and carefully stored all those years ago was brought out again. The focus was particularly on trace DNA. Forensics teams, equipped with advanced processing techniques, began the painstaking work of scrutinizing items from the crime scene that had yielded no useful information in 1987. They were looking for skin cells, minute bodily fluids, anything that could have been left behind by the perpetrator. The process was slow, methodical, and required immense patience. Each sample was carefully extracted, amplified, and then run through increasingly sophisticated databases. It was a search for a ghost, a genetic whisper from the past, hoping that one of those ancient, silent clues would finally speak and identify the hand that had silenced Pastor David Reynolds. The hope was fragile but persistent, fueled by the knowledge that science had finally caught up to the crime. The painstaking work, spanning months of meticulous analysis and countless hours in the lab, culminated in a moment of electrifying discovery. A single, minute DNA sample, meticulously extracted from a fraying thread found near Pastor Reynolds' body, a thread so small it had been dismissed in the initial, less sophisticated forensic sweep, finally yielded a hit. The computer screen, usually a sterile field of numbers and data, suddenly glowed with a name. A real name, attached to a real person. The air in the lab grew thick with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. After 40 years, a ghost had been given a face. The name that appeared was not one from the initial suspect list, nor was it a known criminal. It was a name that, when cross-referenced with church records from 1987, had a minor, almost peripheral connection to the congregation. This individual, whose identity caused a ripple of astonishment among the cold case detectives, was a man named Arthur Jenkins. Arthur had been a sporadic attendee at the church in the mid-1980s, primarily accompanying a family member who was a regular congregant. He wasn't a pillar of the community, nor was he a notorious figure. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man, a ghost in the periphery of the church's vibrant life. The surprise was palpable. Decades of speculation had centered on a vengeful outsider, a robbery gone wrong, or a deeply personal grudge. Yet, the DNA pointed to someone who seemed to melt into the background, a person no one had ever seriously considered. His connection to Pastor Reynolds was virtually non-existent, save for a fleeting presence within the same sacred walls. This unexpected revelation underscored the insidious nature of the crime, committed by someone who had lurked in the shadows. The police response was immediate but measured. The detectives, seasoned by years of false leads and dashed hopes, knew better than to rely solely on a single DNA hit, however compelling. Their initial reaction was a blend of quiet excitement and an almost paralyzing trepidation. They meticulously began to verify every aspect of this new lead. They quietly investigated Arthur Jenkins' life, his movements in 1987, his general demeanor, and his current whereabouts. They wanted to ensure that this wasn't some inexplicable anomaly, a lab error, or a bizarre coincidence. Every alibi, every past interaction, Every minor detail of his life was scrutinized from the distance, careful not to tip him off. The goal was to build an ironclad case around this unexpected suspect before making any move, ensuring that this long-awaited breakthrough would not crumble under scrutiny. The weight of 4 decades of unanswered questions pressed down on them, intensifying their resolve to get it right this time. Meanwhile, oblivious to the seismic shift happening within the Mobile Police Department, Sarah and Michael Reynolds continued their lives, marked by the persistent, dull ache of their unresolved past. Michael was now a man in his early 40s, a loving father himself, who had striven to create the stable, secure family life his own childhood had been cruelly denied. Sarah, now a grandmother, carried the quiet dignity of a woman who had endured immeasurable loss with grace. When the call came, a polite yet urgent request from a detective from the Cold Case Unit, a flicker of something long dormant ignited within them. Hope, tentative and fragile, began to stir. The detective carefully explained that new forensic advancements had allowed them to revisit the evidence from Pastor Reynolds' case. He spoke in measured tones, promising nothing concrete, but the implication was clear: the case was active again. For Sarah, it meant the reopening of old wounds, the raw grief surfacing anew. For Michael, it was a sudden, jarring invitation to confront the specter that had haunted his entire life. The cautious hope they now felt was intertwined with an almost unbearable anxiety, a fear of once again being left with nothing but shattered expectations. The decades had taught them patience, but also the bitter taste of disappointment. Could this truly be the beginning of the end of their long wait for justice? The detectives embarked upon the meticulous and painstaking work of building an incontrovertible case against Arthur Jenkins. This wasn't merely about presenting a DNA match. It was about weaving a comprehensive narrative that would stand the test of a courtroom, connecting the genetic evidence to a living, breathing suspect. They systematically revisited every witness from 1987, those still alive and willing to speak, carefully re-interviewing them, prompting their aged memories with photographs and records from the original investigation. Alibis, once dismissed or deemed insufficient, were re-examined with a fresh, skeptical eye, searching for any cracks or inconsistencies that might have been overlooked in the initial chaos. They pulled city records, employment histories, and any available personal documents pertaining to Arthur Jenkins from the past 40 years, attempting to construct a detailed mosaic of his life. Each piece of information was scrutinized, cross-referenced with the scant details known from the original crime scene. They were effectively building a bridge from the silent, microscopic DNA, backward through time, to the living actions of a man now identified as the primary suspect. As they delved deeper into Arthur Jenkins's life, a clearer, though still unsettling, picture began to emerge. His connection to Pastor Reynolds and the church remained tenuous at best. He had indeed attended services sporadically, mainly to appease an elderly aunt who was a devout member. He was not an active participant in church life, held no volunteer positions, and had no known direct interactions with Pastor Reynolds beyond perhaps a brief handshake after a service. Jenkins himself was a man of quiet habits, described by acquaintances as withdrawn, prone to keeping to himself. He worked a series of unassuming jobs, never truly excelling, never putting down deep roots in any community. The potential motive remained an infuriatingly opaque puzzle piece. There was no apparent animosity, no financial dispute, no romantic entanglement, nothing that immediately screamed reason for murder. Yet, as the detectives pieced together tiny fragments of his past, a pattern of simmering resentment, a deep-seated feeling of being overlooked and undervalued, began to coalesce. He harbored a quiet bitterness towards anyone he perceived as successful or respected, and Pastor Reynolds, with his universally admired charisma and community standing, fit that description perfectly. It wasn't a motive born of logic, but of a quiet, festering envy that had seemingly lain dormant for decades. With the genetic evidence verified and a preliminary but compelling circumstantial case constructed, the time came for confrontation. Arthur Jenkins was brought in for questioning under the pretext of a cold case review regarding an old, minor incident he might have witnessed near the church decades ago. The interrogation room was stark, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. Jenkins initially played the role of the confused citizen, denying any significant memory of the events of that distant Sunday. He maintained a placid, almost bored demeanor, offering vague recollections and feigning bewilderment. He denied knowing Pastor Reynolds well, denied any reason to be at the church late that evening. But the detectives were prepared. They didn't accuse him outright. Instead, they slowly, methodically, presented the pieces of the puzzle they had painstakingly assembled. They spoke of the trace DNA, of the advanced science that had now pierced through the veil of time, of the irrefutable genetic fingerprint found at the scene. The shift in Arthur Jenkins was subtle at first, a flicker in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. His denials grew weaker, his voice losing its indifferent edge, replaced by a strained tremor. The detectives, seasoned by countless interrogations, sensed the breaking point approaching. They gently but firmly continued, laying out the biological evidence, explaining how it could only belong to one person. Finally, cornered by the undeniable truth of his own genetic material, the carefully constructed facade crumbled. The quiet bitterness that had simmered beneath his bland exterior for decades finally erupted, not in violence, but in a torrent of resentful words. He didn't offer a full, tearful confession of remorse, but rather a cold, defiant admission. The DNA, he conceded, was indeed his. He was there. He had committed the act. The evidence, stark and irrefutable, had truly spoken, ending 40 years of agonizing silence. The chilling motive, once shrouded in decades of mystery, finally unraveled with Arthur Jenkins' grudging admission. It wasn't a grand conspiracy, no deep-seated political vendetta, nor even a desperate robbery gone wrong. Instead, it was something far more mundane, yet terrifying in its banality, a festering resentment, a profound envy of Pastor Reynolds' unassailable goodness and widespread adoration. Jenkins confessed that he had felt perpetually overlooked, a ghost in his own life, constantly overshadowed by others deemed more worthy, more successful. Pastor Reynolds, with his radiant charisma, his genuine compassion, and the unconditional love he received from his congregation, embodied everything Jenkins felt he lacked and could never attain. That Sunday evening, Jenkins had lingered after services, hidden in the shadows, fueled by a mixture of alcohol and a simmering, inchoate rage. He watched Reynolds in the quiet sanctity of the church, a man at peace, a man truly loved. That image ignited a spark of irrational fury within Jenkins. It wasn't about anything Pastor Reynolds had done to him. It was about who Pastor Reynolds was, a living embodiment of everything Jenkins secretly craved and bitterly resented. The attack was born of a moment of madness, a sudden, violent eruption of decades of suppressed inadequacy and bitter jealousy. He felt a twisted sense of power in extinguishing such a bright light, silencing the voice that symbolized all his own perceived deficiencies. The shock value of this true motive lay in its sheer pettiness, its almost pathetic origin, yet it resulted in such an immense, devastating loss. Arthur Jenkins' connection to the church, and thus to Pastor Reynolds, was precisely why he had remained beneath suspicion for so long. He was one of those faces you saw but never truly registered. He wasn't a core member, didn't serve on committees, never participated in outreach programs. He was the quiet cousin of a longtime parishioner, occasionally brought to Sunday services, blending seamlessly into the background. He purposefully minimized his interactions, avoiding any real connection with others, including the pastor. He was a peripheral figure, easily forgotten, his presence so fleeting and unremarkable that no one would have ever thought to connect him to such a heinous act. In the original investigation, detectives had focused on disgruntled employees, close associates, or those with obvious disputes. Jenkins, with his virtually invisible presence, simply did not fit any of the established profiles for a suspect. He was a specter, a shadow, and had utilized that anonymity to his advantage, melting away from the crime scene as effortlessly as he had slipped into the church that fateful night, leaving behind only the smallest, most easily overlooked trace of his existence. The public reaction to the arrest of Arthur Jenkins was a maelstrom of emotions. Initial astonishment quickly gave way to a collective exhalation of relief. 40 years. 40 long years of an open wound in the heart of Mobile, finally beginning to close. Yet, Relief was tinged with a profound sadness and lingering questions. How could such an ordinary, unassuming man harbor such darkness? How could someone who walked among them, who occasionally sat in the pews of the very church he desecrated, be capable of such an act? It was unsettling, shaking the community's perception of safety and the nature of evil. People struggled to reconcile the bland, almost forgettable face of Arthur Jenkins with the monstrous crime he had committed. There was anger, too, for the decades of injustice, for Sarah and Michael's protracted suffering, and for the peace that had been stolen from Pastor Reynolds in the sanctuary he loved. The community grappled with the realization that sometimes, the most dangerous individuals are not the ones who stand out, but those who expertly fade into the background. With the genetic evidence, the confession, and the meticulously gathered circumstantial details, the Mobile District Attorney's Office wasted no time. Arthur Jenkins was formally charged with the murder of Pastor David Reynolds. His arraignment was a somber affair, packed with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had haunted their city's history for so long. Jenkins stood emotionless, offering no apologies, no visible remorse, as the charges were read. The legal machinery, slow and deliberate, began to grind. Prosecutors immediately began the painstaking process of preparing for trial. This would be a landmark case, not just because of its age, but because it represented the triumph of perseverance and scientific advancement over a seemingly impenetrable cold case. They knew the defense would attempt to discredit the DNA evidence, or perhaps argue for a diminished capacity due to Jenkins's psychological state. But the prosecution was confident. They had the science, the admission, and most importantly, the truth. Mobile braced itself for the trial, a final, necessary step towards true justice and a belated reckoning for a crime that had cast a long, dark shadow over generations. The community held its breath, hoping that one last battle would finally bring closure. The trial of Arthur Jenkins became a focal point for the entire state of Alabama, a stark reminder of a past horror finally brought to light. Weeks of intense legal proceedings unfolded inside the Mobile County Courthouse, each day meticulously dissecting the events of that fateful Sunday in 1987. The prosecution, spearheaded by a formidable team of district attorneys, systematically presented their compelling evidence. They began with the irrefutable DNA, a silent, microscopic witness that transcended time, linking Jenkins directly to the crime scene. Detailed forensic testimony explained the advancements that had made identifying this trace evidence possible, underscoring the scientific certainty of the match. Jurors listened intently as crime scene photographs, once faded and grainy, were now digitally enhanced, showing the sacred space defiled by violence. The prosecution then delved into Jenkins's own grudging admissions, meticulously recounting the detective's interview, highlighting the killer's cold and calculating demeanor even decades later. They painted a picture not of a momentary lapse, but of a deeply entrenched resentment that had tragically culminated in murder. But perhaps the most emotionally impactful moments came from the witnesses who took the stand. Sarah Reynolds, now a woman etched with the lines of endurance, testified with a quiet strength that belied the immense pain she had carried for so long. Her voice, though sometimes trembling, described the kind, loving man Pastor David Reynolds was, the vibrant life stolen, and the gaping void left in their family. She spoke of the years of uncertainty, the agony of not knowing, and the constant ache of injustice. Her son, Michael, now a grown man, followed her testimony. He recounted growing up without a father's guidance, the unspoken questions that had shaped his identity, and the heavy burden of a tragedy that refused to fade. His testimony was a poignant narrative of a stolen childhood and a life forever altered, a raw, heartfelt plea for justice that resonated deeply within the courtroom. The defense, on the other hand, struggled against the overwhelming evidence. Their strategy primarily revolved around questioning the chain of custody for the decades-old DNA sample and attempting to cast doubt on the accuracy of the lab results. They tried to portray Jenkins as a victim of circumstance, a lonely, confused man coerced into an admission, or even suggested alternative, unknown perpetrators. But their arguments rang hollow against the weight of the prosecution's carefully constructed case. For Sarah and Michael, sitting through the trial was an agonizing journey back through their darkest memories. Every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, forced them to relive the trauma as if it were happening all over again. They saw images of the crime scene they had tried for decades to erase from their minds. They heard the chilling details of David's last moments, fragments of which had been withheld from them for their own protection. It was an emotional gauntlet, a constant battle against the tide of grief and anger that threatened to overwhelm them. Yet there was also a fragile sense of purpose, a renewed determination to see this through, not just for themselves, but for David's memory. Sarah held Michael's hand tightly during particularly difficult testimonies, silently drawing strength from each other. They were there to represent their beloved pastor, to be his voice in a courtroom where his killer sat emotionless, a stone's throw away. This wasn't merely a legal process, it was a deeply personal quest for validation, for the acknowledgement that David Reynolds' life mattered, and that his death would not go unpunished. The relentless search for closure, for peace, was visibly etched on their faces, a testament to their unwavering resilience. After days of deliberation, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Every eye was fixed on the jury as they filed back in, their faces unreadable. The foreman handed the verdict form to the judge, a moment heavy with 40 years of anticipation. The clerk read the decision aloud, her voice clear and resonant. "We the jury find the defendant, Arthur Jenkins, guilty of the murder of Pastor David Reynolds." A collective gasp, then a wave of quiet, profound relief washed over the courtroom. Sarah and Michael clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces, tears not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, long-awaited release. It was the moment they had yearned for, prayed for 4 decades. Justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Arthur Jenkins, however, remained expressionless, his eyes vacant, absorbing the verdict with an unsettling indifference that spoke volumes about his lack of empathy. Weeks later, the courtroom reconvened for the sentencing. The judge, acknowledging the brutality of the crime and the immense suffering inflicted upon the family and community, delivered a powerful statement. He spoke of the sanctity of human life, the violation of a sacred space, and the enduring impact of Jenkins's senseless act. Arthur Jenkins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The pronouncement brought a final, definitive sense of justice, a period placed at the end of a long, agonizing chapter. For Sarah and Michael, it was not an end to their pain, for loss of this magnitude is never truly forgotten. But it was an end to the agonizing uncertainty, an end to the haunting question of who and why. The sentence ensured that the man who stole their beloved David would spend the remainder of his life accountable for his actions, bringing a measure of hard-won peace to the long-suffering family and the community of Mobile, Alabama. The conviction and sentencing of Arthur Jenkins, while not erasing the profound pain of their loss, brought a fragile yet palpable form of closure for Sarah and Michael. It was an acknowledgement, a definitive answer to the question that had gnawed at their souls for 40 years. The legal battle was over, the perpetrator identified and held accountable. For Sarah, it meant she could finally envision a future not entirely consumed by the ghost of injustice. She could, at last, focus purely on the cherished memories of David, unburdened by the relentless pursuit of his killer. Michael, too, felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the shadow that had darkened his childhood beginning to recede. He could tell his own children that their grandfather's death had been avenged, that justice, however long it took, ultimately prevailed. It didn't bring David back, nothing ever could. But it offered a foundation upon which to build a new sense of peace, a quiet understanding that the scales had finally, irrevocably, tipped towards righteousness. The long-term impact on the community of Mobile was profound, allowing a collective wound to slowly, painstakingly heal. Pastor Reynolds' legacy, however, transcended the tragedy of his death. His life, his dedication, and his unwavering faith continued to inspire, becoming a symbol of enduring goodness amidst unimaginable evil. The resolution of his case highlighted the critical importance of cold case units, these dedicated teams who refused to let time bury the truth. It underscored the transformative power of forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, as a beacon of hope for countless families left in limbo. The case became a testament to perseverance, demonstrating that even the most intractable mysteries can yield to relentless investigation and technological advancement. It taught Mobile, and indeed the broader world, that justice, though sometimes slow, is often inevitable, patiently waiting for the right tools and the right moments to finally emerge from the shadows. The community, once shattered, began to mend, embracing a renewed sense of security and trust, knowing that no crime, no matter how old, would be forgotten. Sarah, now a graceful grandmother, often sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the Mobile sky with hues of orange and purple. She held a worn photograph of David, his kind eyes smiling back at her. The anger had softened into a quiet sorrow, the bitterness replaced by a profound gratitude for the life they had shared, however tragically shortened. He was such a good man, she'd often mused to Michael, her voice filled with tenderness. And he deserved justice. Michael, now a father himself, understood the depth of her perseverance, the sheer strength it took to carry such a burden for so long. His own children knew their grandfather through stories, through Sarah's memories, and now, through the knowledge that his killer had been brought to account. He reflected on the unexpected turns life can take, how a seemingly ordinary Sunday could shatter everything, and how decades later, an unseen thread of DNA could weave justice back into the fabric of their lives. Their journey was a testament to human resilience, to the unwavering power of love, memory, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The peace they had finally found was hard-won, a testament to their unwavering spirit, ensuring Pastor David Reynolds' light would continue to shine, not just in their hearts, but as a beacon for all who seek justice. If you've been moved by this story of perseverance and the ultimate triumph of justice, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with others who appreciate compelling true crime narratives, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We delve into the depths of unsolved mysteries and celebrated resolutions, bringing you stories that remind us of the incredible human spirit. Up next, we'll be exploring another fascinating cold case where an unexpected witness finally broke a decades-long silence, leading to an arrest no one saw coming. Don't miss it.